The story begins not with a battle cry or a royal proclamation, but with the creak of timber and the smell of salt air. In late 1606, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery pushed away from the English coast, carrying roughly 104 men and boys into the grey Atlantic. They were chasing a promise. The Virginia Company of London had sold them on a vision of untapped land, potential mineral wealth, and the glory of planting England's flag on a continent that Spain had been plundering for a century. What the company's pamphlets did not dwell on were the storms, the fevers, the bad water, or the simple fact that almost none of these men had ever built anything from raw timber in their lives. They were, to put it charitably, optimistic. The crossing itself took just over 4 months. A miserable procession of seasickness, cramped quarters, and disputes that broke out almost immediately among the leaders. Captain John Smith was nearly hanged before the ships even reached the Caribbean, accused of plotting mutiny by men who resented his blunt manner and his insistence on speaking plainly about problems that others preferred to ignore. He survived the crossing, though barely, and would become the central figure in the drama ahead. The ships reached the Chesapeake Bay in late April of 1607, and the men came ashore for the first time in weeks with unsteady legs and wide eyes. The land they saw was genuinely beautiful in the way that wild places are beautiful before you understand what they demand of you. Dense forests stretched to every horizon, laced with rivers that glittered in the spring light. The Powhatan Confederacy had been living in this landscape for generations, farming the river valleys, hunting the deep woods, and trading across a network that stretched from the coastal plains to the inland ridges. Chief Powhatan, whose formal name was Vahunzenakar, ruled over roughly 30 tribes and perhaps 14,000 people. He had seen European ships before, had heard accounts of their strange weapons and their inexplicable desire to accumulate land, and he was watching these new arrivals with a calculation that the English entirely underestimated. The settlers, for their part, saw the land as largely empty and freely available, a misreading that would cost both peoples enormously over the following generations. The choice of settlement site deserves its own moment of dark irony. The council selected a low, marshy peninsula on the James River, pointing into the water like an accusing finger. It offered deep anchorage for the ships, which was genuinely useful, and it appeared defensible on 3 sides by water. What it also offered, though no one recognized this immediately, was brackish water that turned foul with the tides, mosquitoes rising in thick clouds from the surrounding marsh, and soil that drained poorly and bred disease with terrible efficiency. On the 14th of May, 1607, they began unloading and staking out what would become James Fort, named in honour of King James I. The first structures were rough and desperate, triangular walls of sharpened stakes driven into soft ground, a storehouse barely worthy of the name, and shelters that offered more psychological comfort than actual protection against the elements. There was no grand design, no engineer's blueprint. There was only the need to have something standing before nightfall. The social makeup of the company revealed itself almost immediately in who picked up a shovel and who stood watching. English society of the early 17th century was rigidly stratified, and the settlers had carried those hierarchies aboard ship like extra luggage. Gentlemen, men who held social rank and were unaccustomed to manual labour, made up a notable portion of the group. They had come expecting to supervise, to manage, and perhaps to discover gold with minimal personal inconvenience. Craftsmen, soldiers, and labourers formed the working corps, their hands already roughened from honest work, and their patience for gentlemen's excuses already wearing thin within the first week. Food before the worst shortages meant salted meat from the ships, biscuits softened in water, and whatever fish could be pulled from the river. The Powhatan villagers made cautious appearances in those early weeks, sometimes offering corn and fish in exchange for copper discs and glass beads. Exchanges conducted with the wary formality of two groups who understood almost nothing about each other's intentions. Disease arrived before the first summer had fully settled. The river water, contaminated by tidal salt and human waste, sent fever and dysentery through the huts with brutal efficiency. Men who had been healthy in England were dead before the summer heat broke. By the time Christopher Newport sailed back to England in June, with two of the ships, leaving the Discovery behind, the company that had stepped ashore with such charged anticipation was already smaller, quieter, and considerably less certain about what they had volunteered for. The land was real, the promise was not, and the river, which would define every chapter of the story ahead, flowed past the crude wooden gate with perfect indifference to the suffering inside. The days that followed Newport's departure settled into a grim rhythm of survival tasks and mounting dread. Men who had never held an axe learned to fell timber by necessity, their palms blistering on the handles while the Virginia sun pressed down on wool doublets designed for English weather. The gentleman, accustomed to directing from a comfortable distance, quickly discovered that the labourers had no patience for orders from men who would not lift a finger themselves. Arguments broke out over work assignments, over the division of food from the dwindling ship stores, and over who held genuine authority now that Newport had gone. The appointed council, a body of 7 men, whose names had been sealed in a box and revealed only upon arrival, bickered constantly, each member convinced that his judgment was superior and his rivals incompetent. Leadership in those early months was less a structure than a rotating argument, and the colony paid the price in wasted hours and squandered goodwill. Relations with the surrounding Powhatan villages shifted week by week. Sometimes within a single day, small trading parties arrived at the fort's entrance with baskets of corn and strings of dried fish, and the exchanges went smoothly enough when both sides kept their tempers. But the English had a chronic habit of demanding more than the local people could reasonably spare, particularly during a regional drought that had already placed strain on native crop stores. When generosity reached its natural limit, English foraging parties sometimes slipped out at night to dig up planted fields, a violation that the Powhatan neither forgot nor forgave. The suspicion that accumulated through those first months was not dramatic. There was no single incident that turned alliance into hostility. It was more like water finding its way into a wall, slow and invisible until the damage was already done. Powhatan watched from a careful distance, feeding the settlers just enough to keep them alive and dependent, while he assessed exactly how serious a threat these newcomers represented to the world his people had built along the James River. By late summer of 1607, the death toll had become impossible to ignore. Fevers struck one after another through the crowded huts, leaving the living to bury the dead in shallow graves outside the palisade while struggling to complete their own daily tasks. The surgeon worked with the limited medicines brought from England, but the real enemy, contaminated water and the diseases that the swamp bred with such ease, was beyond his tools to address. Some men succumbed within days of falling ill, others lingered for weeks, taking up space and consuming rations while contributing nothing to the work that kept the fort standing. The social niceties of rank dissolved at the graveside. A dead gentleman occupied the same ground as a dead labourer, and the man who dug the hole cared only about finishing before dark. Of the original company, fewer than 40 men were fit for regular work by the time the first frosts arrived, and the triangular fort that had taken so much effort to raise now stood as a monument to just how poorly England had prepared its settlers for the reality of this particular shore. The river flowed past, unhurried and unchanged, while inside the crude walls, the men who remained alive made a quiet calculation endure through winter, or lose everything. The triangular fort that rose on the James River Peninsula in the summer of 1607 was not a monument to English engineering. It was a monument to desperation. Every plank, every sharpened stake, every clod of clay pressed into a wattle wall represented hours of labour extracted from men who were already sick, already hungry, and already beginning to doubt the promises that had carried them across the Atlantic. The structure itself followed a simple design forced by necessity rather than chosen by preference. 3 walls of timber palisade met at rough angles, enclosing perhaps an acre of ground that held a storehouse, a church barely worthy of the name, and rows of shelters that the settlers called houses with a generosity that the buildings did not entirely deserve. Inside this enclosure, life organized itself around the rhythms that survival imposes on all people, regardless of their background or ambitions. Dawn brought the sound of axes striking wood. Midday brought the smell of whatever fish or grain could be boiled into something edible. Evening brought exhaustion so complete that arguments about rank and precedence lost their energy, and men simply lay down on straw pallets and closed their eyes against the damp Virginia night. The physical texture of daily existence inside the fort deserves attention because it shaped every decision that followed. The men who had arrived from England wore clothing entirely unsuited to the environment they now inhabited. Gentlemen's wool doublets, designed for the cool grey weather of an English autumn, became suffocating instruments of misery under the Virginia summer sun, their heavy fabric soaking through with sweat within the first hour of morning work. Knitted stockings developed holes within weeks on the rough ground, and the leather shoes that had walked the cobbled streets of London dissolved in the constant mud around the well. Labourers fared only slightly better in their coarser canvas jerkins and linen shirts, garments that at least breathed more readily in the heat but offered almost no warmth when the cold arrived. Food before the shortages grew critical consisted of whatever the ship stores had carried across the ocean: salted beef or pork from sealed barrels, ship's biscuit that needed soaking before it could be chewed without breaking teeth, and dried peas or barley boiled into a porridge that provided sustenance without pleasure. The river supplemented this diet with real generosity when conditions allowed. Catfish, perch, and the occasional massive sturgeon that caused genuine excitement when hauled into the shallop provided fresh protein that kept the weakest settlers from tipping over entirely. Native corn, received in trade from Powhatan villages in those early cautious exchanges, was ground into meal and added to the common pot with increasing frequency as the English grain ran low. The Powhatan people who observed these activities from the edges of the cleared ground occupied a world of remarkable sophistication that the English settlers were too exhausted and too culturally blinkered to fully appreciate. Powhatan villages were organized around long houses covered with woven mats or sheets of bark, their interiors warm and efficiently arranged around central fire pits. The 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, grew in carefully managed fields that were planted in small hills designed to support each other's growth, a system that maintained soil fertility far more effectively than the English practice of row planting had achieved. Powhatan women managed the fields, moving through the growing season with the knowledge of people who had been reading this particular landscape for generations. Warriors travelled through the surrounding forest with a silence and speed that astonished the English on the rare occasions they witnessed it, their familiarity with every trail and waterway giving them an intelligence advantage that no amount of English firearms could entirely compensate for. When trading parties arrived at the fort's gate with baskets of corn balanced on their heads and dried fish hanging from carrying poles, they were not performing an act of charity. They were conducting a calculated exchange that served Powhatan's broader strategy of keeping the English alive. Dependent and contained, Christopher Newport sailed for England in June of 1607 with 2 of the original 3 ships, taking with him letters, a small cargo of clapboard and sassafras root, and the colony's best hope of a quick return visit. He left behind a company already reduced by illness and already confronting the gap between what the Virginia Company's promotional literature had promised and what the James River Peninsula was actually delivering. The men who watched the sails disappear downstream understood with a clarity that no pamphlet had prepared them for, that they were now genuinely alone, in a way that the word alone had never quite meant in England, where the next village was always within walking distance, and the next meal was rarely in serious doubt. Hunting parties ventured out when the weather allowed, returning with modest game, a squirrel or 2, occasionally a turkey, rarely enough to make any real difference to stores that were measured in weeks rather than months. Inside the fort, the basic shelters provided thin protection against the cold when the first frosts arrived in autumn, and the fires that burned in the huts filled the rooms with wood smoke because proper chimneys had not yet been built. Men coughed through the nights and rose pale and unsteady in the mornings to face another day of the same narrow circle of tasks. The river kept its own pace through all of this, offering fish when the season favoured and nothing when it did not, carrying the cold air downstream in the dark mornings with the indifference of something that had been flowing long before the English arrived and intended to keep flowing long after whatever happened to them. By the time the first full winter settled over the fort in early 1608, the original company of over 100 had been reduced to fewer than 40 men still capable of useful work. The rest lay in the huts burning with fever, or already beneath the ground outside the palisade, in graves that the survivors had dug with tools growing dull from constant use. The social distinctions that had seemed so important on the voyage over had not disappeared, but they had been severely renegotiated by circumstance. A gentleman who refused to carry water or cut firewood found that his rank earned him increasingly little sympathy from men who had been working since dawn. The labourers and soldiers, accustomed to hard physical effort, adapted more readily to the demands of frontier survival, but even they strained under the combination of disease, inadequate food, and the psychological weight of isolation. Women were present in small numbers at this stage, mostly wives or servants of the more senior settlers, and they managed the cooking fires and the care of the sick with a quiet efficiency that the surviving records tend to understate. Children helped where they could, carrying kindling and water, learning the rhythms of the fort before they were old enough to fully understand the danger surrounding it. The Powhatan continued their cautious engagement through the autumn and into the winter months, sometimes arriving with additional corn when their own stores permitted, sometimes sending only a runner with a message that trading was suspended without explanation. Chief Powhatan was never simply generous and never simply hostile. He operated with the patience of a man who understood that time was on his side, that the English needed him far more than he needed the English, and that the copper and glass beads they offered in exchange for corn were interesting curiosities rather than essential resources. His daughter, a young woman the English called Pocahontas, appeared occasionally at these exchanges, her presence noted by the settlers as an informal signal that the meeting was proceeding within acceptable boundaries. The relationship between the two groups in these early months was a careful dance of mutual assessment, neither side ready to commit fully to friendship or to open conflict, both sides watching for the moment when the balance might shift in their favour. Newport returned in January of 1608 with the first resupply, bringing fresh food, tools, and roughly 100 additional settlers. The ships anchored in the river under grey winter skies, and the newcomers who stepped ashore saw for the first time what a colonial outpost actually looked like after 6 months of struggle. Patched roofs, hollow faces, the sound of coughing drifting from the huts. The fresh arrivals included more craftsmen, carpenters and blacksmiths and brickmakers, whose skills immediately began improving the fort's basic infrastructure. A larger storehouse went up. The church was expanded. New sections of palisade replaced the weakest of the original stakes. The barrels of meal and salt meat that came ashore from the supply ships filled the storehouse with a temporary abundance that lifted spirits considerably. Even as everyone understood it would not last indefinitely, the fort settled into a slightly steadier rhythm as winter deepened, its people drawing on the new supplies while the river ran cold and grey outside the walls, and the Powhatan watched from their own comfortable long houses and waited to see what the spring would bring. There are moments in history when a single personality becomes the difference between a community surviving and a community dissolving, and the autumn of 1608 at Jamestown was one of those moments. John Smith was not a man designed by nature or upbringing for diplomacy or patience. He was a soldier who had fought in the religious wars of Central Europe, had been captured by Ottoman forces and sold into slavery, had escaped by killing his master, and had made his way back to England with the kind of resume that either impresses people enormously or makes them deeply uncomfortable. At Jamestown, he had spent his first year as a source of considerable friction, arguing with the council, pushing for stricter discipline, and refusing to pretend that problems did not exist when they were standing directly in front of everyone. By September of 1608, the council elected him president, partly because his approach had produced measurable results, and partly because the other candidates had either died or exhausted everyone's patience. Smith took the role with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for permission to do things properly, and he set about transforming the fort's daily operations with a speed and thoroughness that the gentlemen of the council found both admirable and deeply inconvenient. The rule Smith introduced was simple enough to be posted on the storehouse door without requiring explanation. Those who did not work would not eat. Full portions went to men who completed their assigned tasks. Reduced portions went to those who did not. No exceptions were made for rank or title, or the elaborate social excuses that gentlemen in early 17th century England had refined into something approaching an art form. The change produced immediate results. Men who had spent months finding creative reasons to avoid manual labour suddenly discovered a remarkable capacity for carpentry, gardening, and the carrying of heavy barrels. The work gangs that Smith organised each morning operated with a precision the fort had never previously achieved. Carpenters repaired roofs and replaced weakened palisade stakes. Labourers cleared additional ground for planting and dug a deeper well near the centre of the enclosure. Soldiers ran regular watches along the parapets in properly scheduled rotations so that no single man wore himself into uselessness from too many consecutive hours of guard duty. Smith kept simple tallies of each team's daily output and reviewed them each evening with the council, adjusting assignments to match the abilities of the men available. It was not a glamorous system. It was a working one, which in the circumstances was considerably more valuable. Beyond the walls of the fort, Smith pursued the colony's food security with the same methodical determination. He led trading expeditions up the James River and into its tributaries, carrying English hatchets, copper pieces, and strings of glass beads, sitting down with local Powhatan leaders according to their customs, and returning with canoe loads of shelled corn, dried beans, and smoked fish that went directly into the storehouse. These journeys required a particular kind of courage that was different from battlefield bravery. Smith was moving through territory he did not fully control, among people whose language he understood only partially, conducting negotiations where a misread gesture or an impatient word could end badly for everyone involved. He proved genuinely skilled at it, combining the necessary firmness with enough respect for Powhatan protocols to keep the exchanges productive. On one expedition he was captured by warriors loyal to Chief Powhatan and brought before the chief himself at the village of Werowocomoco. What followed has been debated by historians for 4 centuries. Smith's own account, written years after the fact, describes a ceremony in which Pocahontas intervened to spare his life, placing her head against his in a gesture of protection as warriors stood ready to execute him. Whether this was a genuine rescue, an adoption ceremony whose meaning Smith misunderstood, or something else entirely, the encounter reveals how complex and how charged the relationship between the two groups had become by the end of 1607. Smith returned to Jamestown with corn and with a clearer understanding of Powhatan's power than any Englishman had previously possessed. The mapping work Smith undertook during this period represented one of the most practically valuable contributions any individual made to the early colony's survival. He took the shallop and a small crew of trusted companions up the Chesapeake Bay on 2 extended voyages in the summer of 1608, recording river mouths, channel depths, the locations of native towns, and the character of the surrounding terrain with a compass and a systematic attention to detail that was entirely his own. The charts he produced gave the Virginia Company its first accurate picture of the region's geography, showing where future ships could anchor safely, where good soil might be found, and the full extent of the Powhatan territory that the English would need to navigate carefully if they intended to remain. Smith also wrote observations about the native people, their farming methods, their diet, their construction techniques, and their social organization. not out of anthropological curiosity, but out of the practical conviction that understanding the people who controlled the surrounding land was essential to the colony's long-term survival. These writings travelled back to England on the returning ships and helped reshape the Virginia Company's understanding of what kind of venture it had actually funded. Under Smith's presidency, the fort took on a more settled appearance than it had shown at any point since the ships first arrived. The palisade stood straight and firm, its stakes driven deep, and the earthen bank behind them properly packed. New houses rose along the lanes with chimneys that actually drew smoke upward rather than filling every room with a choking grey haze. The storehouse, enlarged and raised on posts to keep grain dry and away from rodents, held more substantial reserves than had ever previously been achieved. Gardens beyond the walls expanded with each passing week, their rows of corn and peas and beans producing yields that supplemented the trade supplies and reduced the fort's absolute dependence on Powhatan generosity. Smith rotated the work teams so that no group bore the heaviest tasks indefinitely, and he listened to complaints only after the day's assignments had been completed. A sequencing that reduced idle grievances considerably. The second winter of 1608 into 1609 passed with significantly fewer deaths than the first, a fact that Smith regarded not as luck, but as the predictable outcome of adequate preparation. The land had not changed. The river had not changed. The Powhatan had not fundamentally changed their approach. What had changed was the discipline inside the walls. And that discipline, simple and unromantic as it was, had bought the colony another season. It had also, though no one inside the fort quite grasped this at the time, created a dependency on one man's particular combination of energy, authority, and practical intelligence that the colony was entirely unprepared to survive without. The relationship Smith maintained with the Powhatan during his time as president was never simple friendship and never open warfare. It occupied the complicated middle ground that both sides found useful and neither side fully trusted. Smith understood that Powhatan provided corn because dependency suited the chief's broader political calculations, not because of any particular warmth toward the English settlers. Powhatan understood that Smith's trading parties were mapping and assessing his territory even as they bargained politely for food. Both men were too intelligent not to recognize what the other was doing, and both proceeded anyway because the immediate practical benefits outweighed the longer-term risks. Pocahontas continued to appear at some of the exchange meetings, carrying messages and occasionally additional food, her presence serving as a kind of informal diplomatic signal that the chief considered the current arrangement acceptable. The Powhatan warriors who sometimes accompanied trading delegations demonstrated their skill with bows and arrows in ways clearly intended to impress the English, while English muskets responded in kind, their noise and range producing the desired effect on observers who had never encountered gunpowder weapons at close range. These mutual displays of capability were not threats. They were the early 17th century equivalent of two cautious neighbours, making certain that both parties understood the full picture before committing to any agreement. By the time autumn of 1609 arrived and the smell of wood smoke from the fort's new chimneys drifted across the river in the morning air, John Smith had created something that had not previously existed at Jamestown, a functioning community rather than a desperate camp. The distinction mattered enormously. A camp reacts to each new crisis as it arrives, spending its energy on survival rather than preparation. A community anticipates, stores, repairs, and trains, building a modest but genuine margin between what it has and what it needs. Smith had pushed the fort from the first condition toward the second through 2 years of consistent insistence on the same basic principles. The gunpowder accident that would end his presidency in October of 1609 had not yet occurred. The third supply fleet had not yet scattered in the Atlantic storm. The impossible equation of 500 mouths and empty storehouses had not yet been written. For one brief season, the colony stood on ground that felt, if not secure, at least solid, and the man most responsible for that solidity walked the lanes each morning with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew exactly how it had been achieved. By the spring of 1609, The Virginia Company of London had reached a conclusion that its own records made unavoidable. The original plan for governing Jamestown was not working. The council system, with its rotating presidents and its chronic internal arguments, had produced 2 years of near collapse, punctuated by brief periods of competence whenever a sufficiently forceful individual managed to impose order on the chaos. The company's investors, who had expected returns by now and received instead a succession of urgent letters requesting more supplies, pushed hard for reorganization. A new royal charter was granted in May of 1609, fundamentally restructuring the venture. Governance would shift from the quarrelsome council to a single appointed governor with clear executive authority, answerable to the company in London rather than to his fellow settlers. Sir Thomas Gates was named as lieutenant governor, with Lord Thomas West, Baron de la Warre, serving as the overall governor whose authority covered the entire enterprise. The new charter also expanded the company's territorial claims and opened investment to a broader public, selling shares to merchants and minor gentry who saw Virginia as a speculative opportunity worth the risk. The reorganization looked impressive on paper, as reorganizations generally do, and the company began preparing a major resupply fleet that would carry the new leadership and several hundred additional colonists to the James River and finally establish the settlement on the firm footing that 2 years of struggle had failed to produce. The fleet that assembled in the spring of 1609 was the largest English colonial venture yet attempted. 9 vessels carried somewhere between 500 and 600 passengers, the biggest single influx of settlers the Virginia Company had ever committed to a single crossing. Gates and his fellow commanders, Admiral Sir George Somers and Captain Christopher Newport, sailed aboard the flagship Sea Venture, the largest ship in the fleet. The passengers aboard these 9 ships represented the full spectrum of English society that the company had been able to recruit, from experienced soldiers and skilled craftsmen to gentlemen anticipating land grants and labourers seeking wages, along with the first significant number of women and children to make the Atlantic crossing for Virginia. The departure generated genuine excitement in London. Sermons were preached on the righteousness of the colonial enterprise. Pamphlets circulated describing the abundant land and the opportunity awaiting those brave enough to claim it. The Virginia Company had invested heavily in the promotional literature, and the promotional literature had done its job. Hundreds of people stood on the docks with their possessions bundled and their expectations high. Boarding ships toward a destination they knew primarily through words written by men with a financial interest in making it sound appealing. The Atlantic delivered its verdict on those expectations with characteristic indifference. In late July, as the fleet crossed the open ocean, a massive storm struck with a violence that scattered the 9 ships across hundreds of miles of dark water. The Sea Venture, carrying Gates, Somers, Newport, and the bulk of the planned provisions, was driven off course for 2 terrifying days before its commanders made the decision to run the stricken ship deliberately onto the reefs of Bermuda rather than watch it sink in open water. The hull grounded on the coral, and by extraordinary fortune, the reef held the wreck stable long enough for all 150 passengers and crew to make it ashore alive. They were stranded on an uninhabited island in the middle of the Atlantic, with no way to communicate with either England or Virginia, while the other 7 ships of the fleet pressed on without them through the aftermath of the storm. The survivors on Bermuda were not in immediate danger. The islands proved unexpectedly generous, thick with wild pigs left by earlier Spanish visitors, filled with sea turtles and abundant birds, and laced with fresh water. They would survive their 9 months on those reefs in considerably better condition than the people they were supposed to be rescuing in Virginia. But none of that comfort reached Jamestown. What reached Jamestown was the consequence of their absence. The 7 remaining vessels, battered and leaking, made their way up the James River and anchored off the landing stage in late August of 1609. They carried approximately 400 colonists, a number that had seemed manageable when calculated against the expected full fleet and its provisions. but which became immediately alarming when the ship's actual cargo was assessed against the reality of the fort's existing stores. The supplies that had been planned for the entire venture were now divided between an island in the Atlantic and 7 damaged ships, whose holds had been partially swamped during the storm. The newcomers who stepped ashore found a settlement that had been functioning under Smith's disciplined management, but which was nowhere near prepared to absorb 400 additional mouths in a single afternoon. The fort's population jumped from roughly 500, counting the existing settlers, within the space of hours, and the arithmetic of the situation was stark enough that even the most optimistic gentleman among the new arrivals could not entirely ignore it. The storehouse that Smith had worked so carefully to fill was suddenly serving more than double the number it had been provisioning the week before. Tents and temporary shelters went up along the lanes as carpenters scrambled to frame additional housing. Livestock driven ashore rooted through the cleared ground, providing the temporary illusion of abundance while consuming resources that could not easily be replaced. The Powhatan watchers at the tree line observed the sudden swelling of the fort with an attention that was quiet, careful, and entirely purposeful. Chief Powhatan received the reports from his scouts and began adjusting his calculations accordingly. The English had made themselves more vulnerable precisely at the moment when they appeared most numerous, and a man of his experience and patience understood exactly what that combination meant for the season ahead. Inside the fort, Percy and the council worked through the first days after the arrival with the controlled urgency of men who could see a problem clearly but had not yet found its solution. Work details formed each morning to expand the palisade and frame the additional shelters that the new arrivals needed before the weather turned. Carpenters among the fresh colonists proved immediately useful, their skills adding genuine capacity to the building effort. Labourers joined the established teams for woodcutting and garden maintenance, and the extra hands allowed the fishing crews to expand their daily range slightly, bringing back somewhat larger catches from the James River. For the first 2 weeks, the increased activity inside the fort created an atmosphere that almost resembled optimism. More people meant more labour. More labour meant faster building. Faster building meant better shelter before winter. The logic held together as long as you did not examine the storehouse records too carefully. And in the first flush of arrival, not everyone was examining them carefully enough. The gentlemen among the new arrivals proved a particular complication. Many had come with expectations shaped by the same promotional literature that had been circulating in London, and those expectations did not include sharing cramped quarters with labourers or standing watch on a muddy parapet in the middle of the night. They expected land, comfort, and the deference owed to their station, none of which the fort was currently in a position to provide. Percy, whose own background was aristocratic and who lacked Smith's willingness to simply overrule the social hierarchies of English life, found it difficult to impose the strict labour requirements that the situation demanded. Small exemptions were made, small relaxations of the work rules followed. Each concession was individually minor and collectively significant, because the stores that might have lasted through a carefully managed winter were now feeding a much larger company under a management system that had lost some of its earlier precision. The summer heat that pressed down on the expanded enclosure did nothing to improve anyone's temper, and the sickness from the voyage that the new arrivals had brought with them spread through the crowded huts with the efficiency that close quarters always provided. The river continued its steady, indifferent flow past the landing stage, carrying the empty ships downstream toward England, and leaving behind a fort that had never been more crowded, never been more strained, and never been closer to the catastrophe that was already quietly assembling itself in the cooling air of the approaching autumn. The accident happened on the return journey from a trading voyage up the James River, sometime in early October of 1609. The exact circumstances were never fully agreed upon in the accounts that survivors left behind, but the essential facts were not in dispute. A spark, most likely from a slow match used to light a musket, landed in an open bag of gunpowder stored in the shallop where Smith was resting. The explosion that followed was not large enough to sink the boat or kill anyone outright, but it caught Smith directly across the thigh and hip with a force that burned deep through clothing and flesh, leaving wounds that were severe by any measure and catastrophic in the context of a settlement with minimal medical resources and no prospect of professional surgical care. The men who had been travelling with him pulled him back from the worst of the blast and got the boat moving toward the fort as quickly as the river current would allow. But the damage was already done in a way that could not be undone by speed or good intentions. Smith was conscious through the journey back, which was in some respects worse than the alternative, because the pain of a serious powder burn in the 17th century, before effective analgesics existed and before anyone understood infection in any useful way, was the kind of pain that narrowed the entire world to a single unrelenting point. He arrived at the fort pale, weakened, and in no condition to lead anything. The surgeon did what could be done with the medicine chest's remaining supplies. Salves were applied, bandages changed, and the wounds kept as clean as the environment allowed, which was not particularly clean by any standard that would be recognized later. Smith lay in his quarters for the days that followed, feverish and unable to move without assistance, continuing to issue instructions about work assignments and store management to anyone who would carry them the short distance from his bed to the men who needed them. This was entirely in character. Smith was not a man designed for passive recovery, and the idea of the colony proceeding without his direct supervision clearly troubled him more than the pain. But the body overrules character eventually, and it became apparent within a week that the burns were not healing cleanly in the damp air of the riverside fort. The infection that had established itself in the wounds would not respond to the treatments available, and the council reached the conclusion that Smith needed to return to England, where physicians with proper instruments and properly stocked dispensaries might address what the Jamestown surgeon could not. In October of 1609, Smith was carried aboard one of the vessels preparing to return to England, his leg wrapped in fresh bandages, his face drawn and pale against the discomfort of being moved at all. The ship weighed anchor and caught the outgoing tide, moving downstream past the trees that lined the river until the fort disappeared behind the bend and the James River opened toward the Chesapeake and the Atlantic beyond. John Smith would never return to Jamestown. The colony he had arguably saved through 2 difficult years of disciplined management was now entirely on its own. The silence that followed Smith's departure was not dramatic in the way that absences in stories are sometimes dramatic. No sudden collapse, no immediate catastrophe, no single moment when everything changed at once. It was subtler and in some ways more dangerous than any sudden crisis would have been, because subtle deterioration does not trigger the alarm responses that keep people alert. George Percy assumed the presidency of the council with genuine willingness and genuine limitations. He was an educated man from an aristocratic family, experienced enough in military matters to understand the importance of maintaining defences, and honest enough in his later written accounts to acknowledge that his approach differed from Smith's in ways that mattered. Percy preferred consultation to command. He brought decisions to the full council rather than imposing them on his own authority, which was procedurally correct and practically disastrous in a situation where speed and consistency of enforcement were more important than collegial process. The work rules that Smith had maintained with such deliberate firmness began to soften almost immediately. Gentlemen who had quietly resented being held to the same labour standards as their social inferiors found that Percy's natural deference to rank made it easier to reassign the heavier tasks to others. The daily tallies that had tracked each man's contribution with such careful precision became less precise. The storehouse records showed provisions being drawn down at a rate that the hunting and fishing and garden work were no longer fully replacing. But the shortfall was gradual enough in those first weeks that it registered as a trend rather than an emergency. The news of Smith's departure travelled through the Powhatan communication network with a speed that the English would have found unsettling had they understood how efficiently that network operated. Runners moved between villages along trails that the Powhatan had maintained for generations, carrying information through a system of oral relay that could move news across significant distances within a day or two. Chief Powhatan received the report at his main village and considered its implications with the patience of a man who had been watching the English for more than 2 years and had developed a clear sense of which individuals actually mattered to the settlement's functioning. He had traded with Smith, negotiated with Smith, been mapped and assessed by Smith, and had arrived at a working understanding of the man's capabilities and intentions. The other Englishmen were less legible to him, their authority less clearly established, and their habits less predictable. The departure of the one figure whose presence had given the fort its discipline represented an opportunity that a leader of Powhatan's intelligence and strategic awareness was not going to overlook. The instructions he sent to the villages nearest the James River in the weeks following Smith's departure were not declarations of war. They were adjustments to a strategy that had always been more about patience than aggression, tightening the conditions around the fort in ways designed to accelerate the natural consequences of the English position, without requiring the Powhatan to absorb the casualties that open battle would have cost. Inside the fort, the practical effects of the changed leadership revealed themselves in the small daily decisions that accumulate into outcomes. Hunting parties that Smith would have organized into disciplined, well-armed groups with clear objectives and strict return times now went out with somewhat looser arrangements, sometimes staying out longer than planned and returning with less than expected. The garden plots beyond the walls, which Smith had insisted be tended on a regular rotation, received less consistent attention as Percy's work assignments competed with the natural tendency of a less supervised company to find reasons why today's particular task was less urgent than it appeared. The fishing crews continued their morning routines, which provided some stability, but the catches were not being salted and stored with the same systematic care that had characterized the earlier months. Small amounts of food that should have gone into the communal stores were being consumed immediately rather than preserved, each individual instance too minor to confront directly, the collective effect significant enough to matter deeply when winter arrived and the stores were opened and found lighter than anticipated. The autumn of 1609 carried all its usual beauty along the James River, the leaves turning on the trees that lined the banks, the air cooling to a temperature that must have felt almost pleasant after the brutal summer heat, the river running clear and steady past the landing stage, where the remaining ships rocked at anchor. Inside the fort, the enlarged company of 500 people moved through their days with the varied energy of a group that had not yet been forced to fully confront the arithmetic of its situation. The new arrivals were still adjusting to their surroundings. The veterans were still carrying the habits of the summer's relative stability. Percy was still working to establish his authority over a company whose social complexity made Smith's blunt approach look almost elegantly simple in retrospect. Nobody inside the palisade was yet using the word catastrophe, though the conditions for one had been assembling quietly since August, and the season that would make that word unavoidable was only weeks away from announcing itself in earnest. Chief Powhatan did not announce his decision. He enacted it. There was no formal declaration, no messenger sent to the fort's gate with a proclamation that trade had ended and the surrounding country was now closed to English movement. The change came instead through a series of small withdrawals, each one individually explicable as a seasonal adjustment or a local shortage, collectively amounting to a coordinated strategy of economic and physical isolation that the English inside the fort recognized too slowly and understood too late. Trading canoes that had appeared regularly on the river through the summer simply stopped appearing. Villages that had welcomed bargaining parties with the customary formalities of greeting and gift exchange were empty when English delegations arrived, their granaries shut and their inhabitants gone about other business. The runners who moved between Powhatan villages carried instructions that were clear in their intent and efficient in their execution. The English would receive nothing from this point forward that they had not already taken, and what they had already taken would have to last them through whatever was coming. Powhatan had watched the fort absorb 400 additional colonists in August, and had calculated with a precision that required no written arithmetic that the enlarged population could not feed itself through a Virginia winter without substantial outside assistance. Denying that assistance was not cruelty. It was strategy, patient and purposeful, aimed at forcing the English to weaken, to abandon the site, or to make mistakes that could be exploited. The warriors who took up positions around the fort in the weeks following Smith's departure operated with a discipline that matched the strategy's overall patience. They did not mass for assault. They did not make dramatic appearances on the open ground between the tree line and the palisade walls. They positioned themselves in small rotating groups just beyond effective musket range, close enough to be seen when the light was right and the angle was clear from the parapets, far enough to remain safe from any fire the English could bring to bear without wasting powder on uncertain shots. Their presence was communicative rather than aggressive, a constant peripheral reminder that the country beyond the cleared ground was no longer freely available. Bird calls that the settlers had heard casually through the summer now carried signals between groups of watchers that coordinated movement without requiring any sound that an English ear would recognize as deliberate communication. When English parties ventured out for firewood or water or the nuts and roots that supplemented the thinning stores, arrows came from cover with enough accuracy to drive the foragers back without necessarily hitting anyone. A level of restraint that kept the pressure constant without triggering a full military response that might have altered the calculus on both sides. The Powhatan were not trying to kill the English outright. They were trying to make every action outside the walls costly enough in time and nerve and occasional blood that the settlers would eventually choose not to try. Percy's response to the tightening blockade was careful and within its own terms. Reasonable. He ordered the gates kept closed except when work parties went out under guard. He doubled the watch on the parapets and required that any group leaving the enclosure carry weapons and maintain formation, rather than spreading out across the ground in the casual way that smaller and more confident parties had sometimes done during the summer months. He sent the council's more diplomatic members to the nearest villages with additional gifts of copper and beads, attempting to restart the trading relationships that had sustained the fort through the previous seasons. These delegations returned without corn and without any clear explanation of why the exchange that had seemed mutually beneficial for 2 years had suddenly ceased to function. The Powhatan who spoke with them were polite and offered nothing. Some delegations found nobody to speak with at all, the villages presenting closed longhouses and unattended fields stripped of their late harvest. The strategic withdrawal was so complete and so consistent across multiple villages that it could not be attributed to local conditions or individual decisions. It was clearly coordinated, clearly deliberate, and clearly the product of Powhatan's authority being exercised across his entire network with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades establishing exactly the kind of control that made such coordination possible. The practical effects inside the fort accumulated with the quiet persistence of a tide coming in. Firewood cutters who had previously ranged 200 or 300 yards into the surrounding trees now worked closer to the walls, taking smaller timber that burned faster and required more frequent trips. Each extra trip was another opportunity for an arrow from cover, so the trips grew shorter and the loads grew lighter, and the wood stacked inside the palisade dwindled faster than it was being replenished. Hunting parties came back empty-handed with increasing regularity, not only because the watchers at the tree line made deep woods movement dangerous, but because Powhatan's people had systematically hunted the deer and turkey from the ground nearest the fort, driving the game farther inland where no English party could safely follow. The river remained the most reliable source of food, and the fishing crews went out each morning with the knowledge that what they brought back would be divided among 500 people, and that each person's share would be smaller than it had been the week before. The gardens that Smith had established beyond the walls received less attention as the risk of working in exposed ground grew, and what remained unharvested in the plots was sometimes taken overnight by Powhatan raiders who moved through the darkness with the confidence of people who had known this landscape intimately long before any English ship had entered the Chesapeake Bay. Inside the huts, the conversation shifted in register as October gave way to November and the nights grew longer and colder. Men who had been arguing about work assignments and social precedents in September were now talking about food with the focused attention that hunger always eventually produces. How much corn remained in the storehouse, how many days the current ration rate could sustain the company, whether a larger armed expedition to the nearest village might succeed where the smaller diplomatic parties had failed. Percy held the council to careful deliberation on each proposal, understanding that a failed military action against the Powhatan would cost men and powder that could not be replaced, and might provoke a response that turned a strategic blockade into an outright assault on the fort itself. The Powhatan had chosen their approach with considerable intelligence. maintaining pressure through denial rather than violence, and a clumsy English countermove could easily hand them a justification for escalating to something far more destructive. The council voted against large offensive expeditions each time the proposal arose, and the decision was correct in its strategic logic, even as it left the settlers with no good options for addressing the shortage that was developing behind the storehouse doors. The women inside the fort experienced the tightening siege in the particular way that those responsible for feeding a community experience any shortage. Earlier and more precisely than those who simply show up at the kettles expecting to be served. They managed the cooking fires and the distribution of rations. And they were the first to understand in practical terms what the declining corn supply meant in terms of how thin the morning porridge had to be stretched to go around the full company. They gathered what herbs and greens could still be found near the walls, boiling them into supplements that added little nutrition but provided the psychological comfort of a fuller bowl. They mended clothing that was wearing through faster than it could be replaced, turning worn wool into patches and unravelling old canvas for thread. Their labour was continuous and largely invisible in the council records that Percy kept, noted only in the aggregate of the colony's survival rather than in the individual accounting of each hour's contribution. Children moved through the lanes with the adaptability of the young, finding useful tasks without being explicitly assigned them, carrying water and gathering kindling with the uncomplaining practicality of people who had no previous standard of comfort to mourn. By the time the first hard frosts arrived in early November, the strategy Powhatan had set in motion had achieved its first objectives. The English were contained inside their walls, their movement restricted, and their food supply cut off from the external sources that had sustained them through the previous seasons. The storehouse held what it held, and nothing more was coming from the surrounding country. The river still offered fish, and the walls still stood, and the guards still walked their rotations in the cold morning air. But the balance that Smith had worked so carefully to establish, the margin between what the fort consumed and what it could obtain, had tipped, quietly and irrevocably, in the direction that Chief Powhatan had intended. The winter that was settling over the James River Peninsula was not simply a cold season to be endured with adequate preparation. It was the active instrument of a deliberate plan, and the people inside the triangular enclosure were about to discover exactly how effective that plan had been designed to be. The mathematics of the colony's situation in the autumn of 1609 required no particular expertise to calculate, only the willingness to look at the numbers honestly and follow them to their conclusion. 500 people inside a triangular enclosure on a marshy Virginia peninsula, with stores that had been planned for a fraction of that number. With the Powhatan blockade cutting off the external food sources that had bridged the gap between what the fort produced and what it needed, with no reliable information about when the next supply ship might arrive and every reason to suspect that the Sea Venture's wreck had delayed relief by months, the arithmetic produced an answer that nobody inside the walls was prepared to say aloud in those early autumn weeks, because saying it aloud would have required confronting the full weight of what it meant. And the full weight of what it meant was more than any community could absorb without either dissolving into panic or retreating into a denial so complete that it prevented the small practical actions that might still make some difference. Percy kept the council meetings focused on immediate tasks rather than long projections. The daily work assignments continued. The fishing crews went out each morning. The guards walked their rotations. The appearance of organised routine was maintained with a deliberateness that was itself a form of leadership, even if the routine was no longer producing the outcomes it had once reliably delivered. The new settlers who had arrived in August carried with them the particular vulnerability of people who had not yet learned to read the signs that the veterans inside the fort had been studying for 2 years. They did not know which sections of the riverbank produced the best fish at which tides. They did not know which wild plants near the walls were edible and which were not. They did not know the difference between the bird calls that meant nothing and the ones that meant Powhatan watchers were moving positions in the tree line. They had arrived expecting a functioning settlement with established routines that they could slot into, and what they found instead was a fort under increasing strain that needed them to contribute immediately and effectively in ways that their backgrounds had not prepared them for. Gentlemen among the new arrivals proved especially difficult to integrate into the labour system that the situation required. Some had come with servants whose presence complicated the work assignment structure. Others had come with letters of introduction that they presented to Percy as if the social protocols of London might still carry weight on the banks of the James River in November. Percy, bound by his own aristocratic instincts from imposing Smith's blunt standard on men of his own class, made accommodations that the situation could not afford. The sickness that the voyage had introduced into the overcrowded fort spread through the huts in October with the efficiency that close quarters and compromised nutrition always provide. The new arrivals carried illnesses incubated during the Atlantic crossing, and those illnesses found in the existing settlers, a population already weakened by 2 years of inadequate diet and recurring fever. The surgeon moved between shelters with the same limited medicines he had been rationing since the ships first arrived, his stocks diminishing faster than any resupply could replenish them, his ability to treat the underlying causes of what he was seeing essentially non-existent given the state of 17th century medicine. Dysentery moved through the company with particular cruelty, because it stripped the body of what little nutrition the thin rations provided, creating a cycle of weakness that accelerated faster than any other single factor except outright starvation. Men who had arrived in August looking reasonably healthy were by October hollow-eyed and slow. Their capacity for physical work reduced precisely at the moment when physical work was most urgently needed. Women managing the sick in the huts found themselves tending more patients with fewer resources each week, boiling the same small quantity of dried herbs into weaker and weaker infusions as the supply of anything medicinal ran toward zero. The livestock that the August ships had brought ashore provided a brief illusion of abundance that made the underlying reality harder to confront clearly. The pigs and goats that rooted through the cleared ground and grazed along the palisade edges represented a food reserve that everyone could see and count, which gave the stores a visible solidity that the dwindling barrels in the storehouse did not. What the visible presence of the animals obscured was that their numbers were finite, that they were consuming resources of their own, and that once slaughtered they could not be replaced from within the colony's own means. The horses that had been brought for transport and agricultural work represented an even larger food reserve in theory, though the council hesitated to begin consuming animals whose working value had not yet been fully extracted. The delay was understandable and ultimately irrelevant, because the winter would force the decision regardless of what the council preferred. Each week that passed without substantial new food coming into the fort from fishing or foraging or trade meant another week's worth of supplies consumed from a finite total. And the total was already smaller than anyone wanted to state plainly in the council meetings where Percy reviewed the figures and the other members nodded and returned to their huts without quite finding the words for what the numbers of S implied. The Powhatan watchers at the tree line observed the expanded activity inside the fort through October with the attentiveness of people who understood precisely what they were watching. The additional smoke rising from extra cooking fires, the larger fishing parties on the river, the increased frequency of work parties attempting to gather wood or roots from the ground near the walls. All of these told a coherent story to observers who knew this landscape and its carrying capacity better than any English settler ever would. The warriors rotated through their watching positions with the disciplined patience that Powhatan's strategy required, maintaining just enough visible presence to keep the settlers cautious without providing sufficient concentration of force to justify a major English military response. Occasional arrows flew when foraging parties pushed too far from the safety of the palisade, precise enough in their targeting to communicate intent without causing the casualties that might have hardened the English council into authorizing the kind of large armed expedition that could have disrupted the blockade's careful balance. The Powhatan did not need to attack the fort to achieve their objective. They needed only to maintain the conditions that prevented the fort from feeding itself. And those conditions were holding with a consistency that the autumn weeks confirmed again and again. Percy called additional council meetings as November advanced, and the temperature dropped and the morning ration at the common kettles grew measurably thinner each week. He reviewed the storehouse records with the other members. The figures laid out in the careful handwriting he maintained, regardless of the circumstances. And the council discussed options that were growing fewer and less promising as the season progressed. Sending a delegation to Powhatan's main village to appeal directly to the chief was proposed and rejected on the grounds that the journey was dangerous, and that a direct appeal was unlikely to succeed given the systematic nature of the withdrawal that had been underway since Smith's departure. Organising a large armed raid on the nearest native granaries was proposed and rejected on the grounds that the powder and shot required for such an expedition could not be replaced if lost, and that the Powhatan response to open aggression might eliminate the last remaining possibility of resumed trade. Waiting for the supply ships was the option the council returned to each time the others were exhausted, because it was the only course of action that required nothing from the fort's dwindling resources, and because the alternative to believing that help was coming was a conclusion that the council was not yet prepared to formally reach. The river flowed past the landing stage under skies that grew heavier and greyer with each passing week, and the people inside the triangular enclosure moved through their narrowing days with the focused quietness of those who have begun, without quite admitting it, to understand that the situation they are in has already moved beyond the point where good decisions can fully correct it. England in the early 17th century organised itself along lines of social rank so firmly established that most people accepted them the way they accepted the weather, as a fundamental condition of existence rather than a human arrangement that could be questioned or renegotiated. The settlers who crossed the Atlantic to Jamestown carried those lines with them as naturally as they carried their clothing and their cooking pots, and the fort that rose on the James River Peninsula reproduced English social hierarchy in miniature with a fidelity that the circumstances would eventually make impossible to maintain. At the top of the colony's social structure sat the gentlemen, men who held rank by birth or purchase, and whose identity was inseparable from the distinction between themselves and those who worked with their hands. A gentleman directed, a gentleman assessed, a gentleman offered opinions on policy and strategy and the management of lesser men. What a gentleman emphatically did not do, at least not voluntarily and not without significant protest, was carry water, des latrines, split firewood, or perform any of the other physical tasks that the fort required in enormous quantities every single day, simply to remain standing. Below the gentlemen in the social order came the craftsmen and artisans, men whose skills gave them a defined place in the working economy of the settlement. Carpenters, blacksmiths, brickmakers, and coopers occupied a middle position that was practically valuable and socially intermediate, respected for what they could do even if they could not claim the rank that exempted others from doing it. Below them came the labourers and common soldiers, men accustomed to hard physical effort and long hours, whose expectations of comfort were modest enough to be occasionally met by what the fort could provide. The clothing that each group wore in better times before the worst shortages reduced everyone to the same ragged practicality, told its own story about who was who and what that was supposed to mean. A gentleman of the early 17th century, dressed with deliberate visibility of his status, wearing a fitted wool doublet with slashed sleeves that showed the linen shirt beneath, close-fitted breeches of good broadcloth, knitted worsted stockings, and a felt hat trimmed with a narrow band of ribbon or cord. His shoes were of soft leather, his gloves of kid, and his rough or falling band collar was starched to a crispness that required both the linen itself and the starch that stiffened it. Starch that would later find its way into the boiling pots of the Starving Time as a food source when nothing else remained. The labourer dressed for function rather than display, in a canvas, jerkin, worn over a coarse linen shirt, loose breeches of heavy cloth that could withstand mud and rough ground, thick wool stockings, and sturdy leather boots, or shoes that were designed to last, rather than to signal anything about the wearer's inner life. Soldiers added buff leather coats and the occasional piece of metal armour, more useful for the psychological authority they projected than for the practical protection they offered in a landscape where the enemy operated from cover and rarely presented a target that plate armour was designed to address. Women in the settlement occupied a space that the colony's records acknowledge less fully than their actual contribution warrants. They were fewer in number in the early years, arriving in greater quantities only with the later supply fleets, and their roles were organised around the domestic economy that kept the fort's internal life functioning. They managed the cooking fires that fed the entire company, an operation that required constant attention to wood supplies, water quality, the proper preparation of whatever the fishing crews and hunting parties brought back, and the careful rationing of the stored grain that was the settlement's primary hedge against starvation. They tended the sick in the huts, providing what care was possible with the limited medicines available and the considerable practical knowledge of herbal remedies that most women of the period carried as a matter of basic household competence. They mended and repaired the clothing that wore out faster in Virginia's rough conditions than anyone had anticipated, turning worn garments into patches and finding creative uses for every scrap of fabric that could not be repaired back into wearability. Children helped with the smaller tasks that collectively mattered enormously, carrying water and kindling, tending the garden plots when the ground was safe to work, running messages between different parts of the enclosure, and learning by observation the practical skills that would determine whether they survived long enough to grow up. Their presence in the fort added a dimension to the settlement that the records of council decisions and trade negotiations tend to obscure. The domestic texture of daily life that kept people fed, clothed, sheltered, and connected to one another across the long months of difficulty. Food in the fort before the worst shortages reflected the same social distinctions that clothing made visible. Gentlemen expected and sometimes received preferential access to the better preserved meats and the wheat bread that English palates identified with civilized eating. Labourers and soldiers ate from the common stores with less ceremony and less expectation of variety, their portions measured by necessity rather than status. Native corn, obtained in trade from Powhatan villages and ground into meal for porridge, had become a staple for the whole company by the end of the first year, its presence on the menu representing an unacknowledged but significant adaptation to local conditions that the promotional literature back in England had not quite envisioned. Salted fish from the river supplemented the stored meat when the catches were good, and venison or turkey from successful hunting expeditions provided occasional variation that briefly lifted the mood of the entire enclosure. The simple pleasure of a full meal, unremarkable in England, had become a notable event at Jamestown by the end of the first winter, and the memory of what adequate food felt like provided some of the emotional fuel that kept people working through seasons when adequate food was more aspiration than reality. When the starving time arrived and the kettles held only thin broth made from boiled leather and river water, the social categories that had governed access to food dissolved completely. A starving gentleman and a starving labourer presented identical faces to the world, hollow-cheeked and dull-eyed, their former distinctions of dress and deportment visible only in the increasingly ragged remnants of clothing that hunger had reduced to a common currency of patches and desperation. The doublet that had once marked a man's rank now served only to determine how many strips of boiled leather his collar starch might yield. A renegotiation of value so complete and so unsentimental that it would have been unimaginable to the man wearing it when he stepped aboard the ship in England, with his expectations intact and his social position secure. The Powhatan people, who watched the English from the tree line and from occasional trading visits, occupied a social world that was no less organised than the English one, though organised along entirely different principles that the settlers were too preoccupied with their own survival to study carefully. Powhatan society distinguished between the Weronces, the chiefs and leaders who held authority over individual villages, the priests and spiritual leaders who maintained ceremonial knowledge and advised on matters beyond ordinary decision-making, and the common people who farmed and hunted and built the longhouses that sheltered entire extended families under one roof. The Weronces wore copper ornaments and decorated deerskin garments that marked their status with a clarity that the English could recognize even without understanding its specific significance. Warriors carried bows of black locust wood and arrows tipped with stone or bone, moving through the forest with a quiet efficiency that made the noise and visibility of an English soldier in full kit seem almost comic by comparison. The Powhatan diet drew on the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash, supplemented by hare. turkey, fish, shellfish, and the various nuts and berries that the Virginia landscape provided in abundance to those who knew where and when to look for them. They were not a people experiencing hunger in the winter of 1609 and 1610. They were a people who had chosen, deliberately and successfully, to ensure that the English would be. The contrast between the two communities through that winter carried an irony that neither side would have articulated, but that the historical record makes impossible to ignore. Outside the palisade, in the longhouses of Powhatan's villages, fires burned warmly in central hearths. The stored corn from the late summer harvest filled the raised granaries, and families ate adequately through the cold months in the way that a people fully adapted to their landscape could generally expect to do. Inside the palisade, men who had arrived from one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, bearing the technological advantages of gunpowder and metal tools and written records and oceanic navigation, were boiling their own boot leather for sustenance. The English class system, which had seemed so fundamental and so permanent that it structured every relationship inside the fort, had been rendered irrelevant by a Virginia winter and a Powhatan chief's patient strategy. Hunger was the great leveller that no charter from the Virginia Company had anticipated, and it performed its levelling with a thoroughness and an equity that the social order it replaced had never quite managed in the other direction. The first hard frosts arrived in early November of 1609, without ceremony or warning, as cold always arrives in places where there is no adequate shelter against it, felt first in the bones before it registers in the mind as a new and defining condition. The river along its edges began to ice over in the mornings, thin translucent sheets that broke when the fishing boats pushed through them and reformed overnight with a little more thickness each time, gradually narrowing the window of navigable water that had been the fort's most reliable source of fresh food throughout the autumn. Inside the triangular enclosure, the cooking fires that had burned with some generosity through the summer and early autumn were now being carefully managed. The wood rationed by the women who understood better than anyone how quickly the stacked supply inside the walls could disappear if each fire was allowed to burn at the rate that genuine warmth required. The morning porridge that had been thin through October grew thinner still as November advanced. The cornmeal stretched further and further into water until what sat in the common bowls was less a food than a gesture in the direction of one, warm enough to hold between cold hands and liquid enough to swallow without chewing, but containing a diminishing fraction of the nutrition that 500 people required to maintain the physical strength that the fort's daily operation demanded. Percy posted the ration allocations at the storehouse door each morning with the same careful handwriting he had maintained since taking over the presidency. The numbers precise and the portions equal. A commitment to fairness that became more painful to honour with each passing week, as the numbers grew smaller and the portions shrank toward the point where fairness and sufficiency were no longer the same thing. The livestock went first, in the sequence that hunger always imposes on communities that have animals they have been reluctant to consume. The pigs that had rooted through the cleared ground since August were slaughtered in the open square, their meat divided with the careful precision that the council now applied to every resource that could be measured and shared. The goats followed, then the horses, animals whose working value had argued for their preservation through the autumn, but whose flesh now represented the difference between eating and not eating, in a calculation that had become too urgent for sentiment. The killing of the horses was noted in Percy's records without elaboration, the factual accounting of a community that had moved past the point where such decisions required discussion. Each animal's slaughter extended the company's survival by a calculable number of days, and the council tracked those days with the attention of people who understood that each one mattered. The dogs that had guarded the gates through 2 years of Virginia nights were next, their absence from the parapets noticed and accepted without comment by guards, who were themselves too weakened by hunger to patrol with the energy those dogs had once contributed. The cats that had kept the storehouse relatively free of rats disappeared into the common pot, with a grim practicality that the settlers later recalled with the particular dark humour that extreme hardship sometimes produces in retrospect. Noting that the animals had at least served the colony faithfully in 2 different capacities before the winter was finished with them, When the animals were gone, the settlers turned to whatever the fort itself and its immediate surroundings could provide. Boot leather, cut into strips and boiled for hours until it softened enough to be chewed without breaking teeth, became a food source that Percy documented with the same neutral precision he applied to everything else, as if the consumption of footwear was simply another item in the colony's resource inventory that happened to have been overlooked in the original accounting. Belts and pouches of leather followed the same path. The starch that had been used to stiffen the rough collars that gentlemen wore as a marker of their social standing was dissolved in water and consumed as a thin paste that provided minimal calories and maximum symbolic distance from the colours, life those collars had represented. Small parties ventured out from the gates in the early mornings when the Powhatan watchers seemed least active, moving quickly across the frozen ground to dig for roots or strip bark from young trees, or collect the few remaining dried berries that still clung to bushes beyond the walls. These expeditions operated under constant risk, arrows flying from cover, often enough to keep the foragers moving fast and close to the palisade, occasionally striking home with enough accuracy to add wounded men to a medical situation that was already beyond the surgeon's depleted capacity to manage. Snakes found in the underbrush were collected and boiled. Mice trapped in the storehouse corners were cleaned and added to whatever else the day had produced. The line between what counted as food and what did not was being redrawn each week by the simple pressure of necessity. Moving steadily in the direction that hunger always drives it, the psychological weight of the winter pressed on the company in ways that Percy's careful records captured only partially and obliquely. He wrote of the sharp prick of hunger that no adequate description could convey to someone who had not experienced it. The way that sustained food deprivation changes the quality of thought and erodes the capacity for the kind of forward planning that might otherwise have produced better outcomes. Men who had argued vigorously about work assignments and social precedents in September sat in near silence through December, their energy too conserved for unnecessary speech. Their attention narrowed to the next meal and the next morning's search party, and the simple mechanical continuation of the routines that kept the fort's basic functions running. The guards walked their parapets through the freezing nights with a steadiness that reflected not courage so much as the absence of any alternative that seemed preferable. The Powhatan fires visible in the tree line on clear, cold nights were noted and recorded and accepted as part of the landscape of the winter, in the same way that the river ice and the frozen ground were accepted, as conditions that existed and had to be endured rather than problems that could be solved. Burials outside the palisade became a daily task, through December and into January. The graves dug as deep as the frozen earth permitted, which was rarely deep enough, marked with wooden crosses that the cold and the wet would eventually reduce to grey sticks indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. January of 1610 brought the deepest cold of the winter and the highest rate of death that the colony had yet experienced. The river froze solid enough along the banks to prevent the fishing boats from launching on many mornings, and the days when the ice broke sufficiently to allow the shallop out produced catches that were divided among so many fewer people each week that the share per person barely increased, despite the shrinking company. The huts that lined the lanes inside the enclosure held fewer occupants with each passing week, not because the buildings had been abandoned, but because the people who had slept in them had been carried outside to the frozen ground beyond the gates. Those who remained moved through the days with the slow, deliberate economy of bodies operating on minimal fuel, every action calculated for its energetic cost, rest taken at every opportunity, speech reduced to what was strictly necessary. The women who managed the cooking fires maintained the daily routines with a consistency that the records suggest was itself a form of survival. The discipline of the familiar, providing a psychological anchor when everything else about the situation had become unfamiliar and threatening. Children moved quietly through the lanes, their smaller bodies requiring less food but receiving the same diminishing portions as the adults. Their adaptability to difficult circumstances providing a resilience that the surviving accounts note with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. February arrived and the death toll continued its steady climb toward the number that would later define the starving time in historical memory. Of the more than 500 people present inside the fort in the previous August, The count of those still living and capable of movement had fallen to somewhere near 60 by the time the worst of the winter had passed. The lanes that had been crowded with the energy of new arrivals only 6 months earlier now felt vast and hollow. The empty huts, standing as quiet monuments to the speed with which a community could be reduced when the essential conditions for its survival were systematically removed. Percy walked those lanes each day with the council book under his arm, entering the morning's numbers with a steadiness that must have required a particular kind of deliberate discipline, recording each death and each small gain from the day's foraging with equal precision, as if the act of accurate record-keeping were itself a form of resistance against the chaos that the winter had imposed. The river outside the walls ran cold and dark between its icy edges, carrying the occasional piece of driftwood that could be retrieved for fuel, offering its small daily gifts to a community that had learned to receive them with a gratitude entirely disproportionate to their size. Because gratitude proportionate to their size would have been no gratitude at all. History has a particular relationship with its most difficult truths. It records them in the margins of official documents, buries them in private journals that their authors never quite decided whether to destroy, and leaves them in the ground where the earth preserves without judgment what human memory prefers to soften or omit. The Starving Time at Jamestown produced accounts that the surviving leaders set down with the careful neutrality of men who understood that what they were describing had no precedent in English colonial experience and would require a particular quality of honesty to convey without either minimizing the reality or sensationalizing it beyond recognition. George Percy was that kind of writer, precise and unsparing in his A True Relation, a document that circulated in manuscript form and was never fully published in his lifetime, perhaps because its contents described things that the Virginia Company's promotional apparatus was not eager to have widely known. Percy wrote about the hunger with the directness of a man who had watched it operate on human beings at close range, describing the sharp prick of want that pressed on the company through the winter months in language that was restrained enough to be credible and specific enough to be devastating. He also wrote about the cases that represented the furthest extent of what that hunger had driven a small number of individuals to do, setting them down in the same measured prose he used for everything else, as if refusing to grant them a different register of language was itself a form of moral accounting. The case Percy documented most specifically concerned a man whose wife had died during the worst weeks of the winter, in the privacy of their shared shelter, with no witnesses and no council oversight to constrain him. The man prepared his wife's body in the manner that meat had been handled in better times, salting what could be preserved for later use and consuming what could not wait. The discovery came when the man's actions were noticed by others in the enclosure, and he was brought before Percy and the council to account for what he had done. Percy recorded the facts of the case without extended moral commentary, noting the act and the council's response, which was measured rather than theatrical, appropriate to a community that had already witnessed so much death that the addition of horror to grief was a difference of degree rather than kind. The council's handling of the situation reflected the pragmatic calculations of leadership under extreme conditions. Public spectacle would have consumed energy and attention that the surviving company could not spare. Formal legal process would have required resources that did not exist. The matter was addressed, recorded, and the community's attention returned to the daily tasks that kept the remaining people alive. Because the daily tasks were what mattered, and the council understood that clearly, even in the worst moments. Other instances that Percy documented were similar in their essential character. Individuals, separated from the main company by the layout of the huts or the isolation that illness imposed, made use of bodies that had already succumbed to the winter's toll. Percy was careful in his accounts to distinguish these cases from violence against the living, noting that what had occurred involved those who had already died, rather than any act that shortened a life that still had days remaining. The distinction mattered to him, and he made it explicitly, because the moral difference between the two was absolute, even if the physical evidence might not immediately reveal it to an observer without full context. The number of documented cases remained small relative to the total population of the fort, a fact that Percy's records make clear and that later historians have consistently emphasized. The majority of the 60 survivors who remained alive by spring of 1610 had sustained themselves through the same combination of careful rationing, desperate foraging, and the consumption of leather and bark and whatever the river provided that the council records describe in their daily accounting. The extreme measures were the exception, taken by individuals pushed past the ordinary limits of endurance in the private darkness of the worst weeks, not the general practice of a community that had abandoned its standards wholesale, what the written accounts could describe only partially and obliquely. The ground at Jamestown preserved with the impartial completeness that archaeological evidence provides when it survives the centuries intact. In 2012 and 13, archaeologists working at the Jamestown rediscovery site excavated a refuse pit dating to the period of the Starving Time and found within it the partial skeletal remains of a young female individual, estimated at approximately 14 years of age at the time of death. The project gave her the name Jane, a placeholder that acknowledged her humanity while respecting the impossibility of recovering her actual identity from the fragmentary record. Jane had arrived with one of the later supply fleets. Her presence at the site, consistent with the influx of colonists who came in the summer of 1609 and found themselves trapped inside the fort when the Powhatan blockade tightened through the autumn. Her bones told a story that confirmed what Percy's written accounts had described, but told it with a specificity and a directness that written language cannot quite replicate, because the marks on bone are not subject to the interpretive choices that a human writer makes in the moment of setting words to paper. The cut marks that the forensic analysts identified on Jane's bones were concentrated on the skull and the long bones of the legs. The locations where muscle tissue would have been most accessible and most substantial, the marks were made by a metal blade, almost certainly a knife of the type that every settler carried as a basic utility tool, and their pattern indicated deliberate and careful removal of flesh, rather than the random cuts that might result from accidental damage or post-depositional disturbance of the remains. Several of the bones showed evidence of having been placed in a vessel over heat. Consistent with the cooking methods available inside the fort, the forensic team noted that the cuts were precise rather than frenzied, matching the careful preparation that was documented in the handling of other food sources during the same period, and suggesting that the individual responsible was operating with deliberate intention rather than in a state of uncontrolled desperation. The analysis was thorough, and the conclusions were stated with the measured confidence appropriate to physical evidence of this quality, providing the historical record with something that Percy's written accounts could not alone supply direct material confirmation that the events described in manuscript form had left their mark in the physical world in ways that survived 400 years of burial. The discovery of Jane's remains generated significant attention when it was announced publicly, and the coverage it received reflected the particular power that archaeological evidence holds in the public imagination. Written accounts can be questioned as exaggeration or propaganda. Bones cannot be argued with in the same way. The cut marks were there, measurable and photographable, and subject to the same analytical standards applied to any physical evidence, and their presence in a pit dated to the Starving Time closed the interpretive distance that had always existed between Percy's careful prose and the reader's willingness to take it fully at face value. What the discovery did not do, and what the archaeologists and historians who worked with it were careful to emphasize, was suggest that Jane's case represented the typical experience of the Starving Time survivors. The other skeletal remains from the same period at the site told the more common story of bodies consumed by hunger and disease and cold, showing the bone density loss and the skeletal markers of severe malnutrition that starvation produces, but not the cut marks of deliberate processing for consumption. Jane's bones stood as one clear and terrible example within a larger record of collective suffering, a single instance of the furthest extreme that a handful of individuals reached when the winter and the blockade and the empty storehouse had taken everything else away. The river that flowed past the palisade walls had carried away the living and left the dead in the ground, and the ground had kept its record faithfully through the centuries until the excavator's tools reached down through 400 years of accumulated earth and brought the evidence back into the light. Spring arrived on the James River in the way that spring always arrives in Virginia. not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual accumulation of small changes that the people watching for them learned to read with the intensity that only prolonged deprivation can produce. The river ice broke earlier along the centre channel than along the banks, opening a narrow corridor of dark water that the fishing crews pushed the shallop into on the first morning. It was wide enough. Standing in the cold bow with their nets ready and their breath visible in the air, returning with catches that were modest by any previous standard and received back at the landing stage with a gratitude entirely disproportionate to their size, the ground along the south-facing sections of the cleared area softened before the rest, and the first wild greens that pushed through the thawing soil were gathered with a care that the settlers had never previously applied to plants. They would have walked past without notice in better seasons. These were not the abundant signs of recovery. They were the earliest and smallest indicators that the season which had been trying to kill the company for 5 months had begun. Very slowly and without any commitment to generosity, to relent. The people who noticed and responded to these signs numbered somewhere near 60, the remnant of a company that had stood at more than 500 the previous August. And the distance between those two numbers was the measure of what the starving time had accomplished between November and the first days of spring in 1610. What those 60 people looked like when Sir Thomas Gates stepped ashore from the Deliverance in late May of 1610 has been described by several witnesses whose accounts agree in their essential details with the consistency of observers recording the same genuine reality rather than constructing a convenient narrative. Hollow faces were the first thing every account mentioned. The skin pulled tight against the bones of cheeks and jaw in the way that prolonged starvation reshapes a human face, eliminating the soft tissue that gives it its individual character and leaving something more skeletal and universal in its place. The clothing that hung on these survivors told its own story. Doublets and jerkins that had been fitted garments 6 months earlier now draped over frames so reduced that the fabric pooled and sagged in ways that made the original cut and quality impossible to assess. Breeches that had been tailored to a man's actual body now required some improvised fastening to stay in place. Their waistbands loose around midsections that hunger had whittled to dimensions their English tailors had never anticipated. Stockings hung in the loose folds of garments worn by someone significantly smaller than their intended owner, and the shoes or boot remnants that remained on some feet showed the systematic removal of leather that had been cut away for boiling, leaving coverings that were more symbolic than functional. The women and children who emerged from the huts with the men showed the same marks of the long winter, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion that comes not from a single night's lost sleep, but from months of the body being asked to operate on resources it did not have. The fort itself reflected its occupants in the way that any built environment reflects the energy and attention of the people responsible for its maintenance. The palisade still stood, which was the most important fact, and the one that represented the most significant ongoing achievement of the winter. Because keeping the walls upright and the gates functional had required daily effort from people who had less daily capacity for effort with each passing week. But the walls showed their age and their neglect in every section that was not strictly essential to the enclosure's defensive integrity. Stakes that had loosened in the winter frosts had been propped rather than reset, leaning at angles that a summer inspection would have demanded be corrected immediately. The earthen bank behind the palisade had slumped in places where drainage had been inadequate, leaving gaps that the remaining guards had compensated for with additional visual attention from the parapets rather than with the physical labour of repair that the situation actually required. The huts that lined the lanes inside the enclosure showed roofs patched with whatever materials had been available in the darkest weeks. Lengths of old sail canvas stretched over gaps where thatch had rotted through. Pieces of bark laid over sections where the original timber framing had given way. The lanes themselves, once kept clear of debris by the work rotations that Smith had established and Percy had maintained with diminishing rigour through the autumn, now showed the accumulated disorder of a community whose members had long since stopped having the energy for anything beyond the minimum necessary to survive another day. The storehouse stood nearly empty, its raised floor swept clean of the last traces of grain. Its shelves, holding only the remnants of the leather processing and bark boiling that had occupied the final weeks of the worst months. The church building, which had served as a council meeting space and an occasional shelter for the weakest members of the company, showed the same marks of hard use and minimal maintenance. Its simple altar still in place and its rough benches still arranged in their rows, but the whole interior carrying the particular smell of a space that had been occupied continuously through a cold winter by people who were sick and frightened and too exhausted to keep it clean. The gardens beyond the walls had gone entirely untended since the autumn, their fences broken in sections and the ground inside them covered with the dead stalks of the previous season's planting and the encroaching weeds that Virginia's soil produced with a generosity it had conspicuously withheld from the English crops. The fishing equipment that had been the colony's most reliable resource through the winter was worn and in need of repair. Nets mended so many times that the patches outnumbered the original material. The shallop's hull, requiring caulking along seams that had opened during the months of hard use in cold water. The daily routines that had kept the 60 survivors moving through the winter continued into the spring weeks with the same mechanical persistence that had characterized them since November. Because the habits of survival once established tend to persist beyond the immediate crisis that produced them, carrying people forward on the momentum of what they have already been doing when the will to make new decisions is not yet available. Search parties still formed each morning at dawn, though their composition had changed as the stronger members rotated to cover tasks previously shared among many more hands. Fishing crews went out with the same regularity. The catches now divided among far fewer mouths than the same effort had served in the autumn, which meant that each person's share was technically larger even as the total remained insufficient for full recovery. The guard rotations continued without interruption, maintained not because 60 people in a weakened fort posed any significant military threat to the Powhatan, but because the discipline of the watch had become one of the remaining structures around which the survivors organized their days. And dismantling it would have meant dismantling one of the last frameworks of communal order that the winter had not managed to destroy. Percy walked the lanes each morning with his council book, recording the day's small developments with the same precision he had applied to the records of death and deprivation through the worst months. His accounts from this period carry a quality that is difficult to name precisely. Something between exhaustion and a kind of stripped-down clarity that prolonged hardship sometimes produces in observers who have been paying close attention for too long. He noted the returning fish with the same neutral tone he had used to record the deaths, neither celebrating the improvement nor minimizing what the winter had cost. The women continued their indoor work, mending and boiling and tending the few remaining sick with the same quiet efficiency they had maintained throughout. Their contribution to the colony's survival, as essential in the spring as it had been in the darkest January nights, and as consistently underrepresented in the official records that future historians would rely on to reconstruct what had happened inside the triangular walls. The river moved past the landing stage with the warmer currents of the advancing season, carrying the promise of open water downstream, while the survivors waited with the particular patience of people who have already waited through everything, and discovered that waiting, done carefully and consistently, is itself a form of survival. The lookouts on the riverside section of the palisade had been watching the river with the habitual attention of men who had been watching it for months without seeing anything worth reporting. When the sails appeared around the bend on a clear morning in late May of 1610, the call that went up from the parapets carried a note that distinguished it immediately from the routine alerts that had punctuated the winter watches. Something in the pitch or the urgency that brought people out of the huts and across the lanes toward the river gate with a speed that their weakened frames had not demonstrated in weeks. What the lookouts had seen were two small vessels moving steadily upstream with the incoming tide, their lines low and compact in the water, their construction noticeably different from the English ships that had anchored at the landing stage in previous seasons. These were not the large supply vessels that the company had been expecting from England, not the reinforced fleet that Lord Delaware was supposed to be bringing across the Atlantic with fresh settlers and substantial provisions. These were something smaller and stranger, built from local materials with the improvised ingenuity of people who had needed a ship and had made one from what was available rather than from what was ideal. The Deliverance and the Patience had been constructed on the beaches of Bermuda over the 9 months since the Sea Venture had ground onto the coral reefs in the storm of 1609. Their hulls shaped from the island's cedar and from timber salvaged from the wrecked flagship. Their rigging pieced together from whatever the survivors had been able to recover from the wreck and supplement with cordage made on the island. Sir Thomas Gates stood in the lead boat as it was rowed ashore from the anchored vessels, his eyes moving across the low peninsula and the wooden walls with the assessing attention of a man who had been carrying a mental image of the settlement he was coming to govern and was now measuring reality against that image. The image had been formed from the Virginia Company's reports and from the accounts of men who had visited Jamestown in better seasons, and it bore a relationship to what Gates actually saw that was more aspirational than accurate. The palisade was standing, which was the first and most important fact, and the gates were open to receive the boats, which meant that the people inside had the awareness and the organization to respond to an arrival. Beyond those basics, the picture was one that no company document had prepared him for. The walls showed their months of minimal maintenance in every leaning stake and slumped earthen bank. The smoke that rose from the enclosure came from only a few points, suggesting a population far smaller than any previous report had indicated. The figures that appeared at the river gate to watch the boats come in moved with the slow, deliberate economy of bodies operating far below their normal capacity, and even at the distance of the river crossing gates, could read in their posture and their pace the story of a winter that had been significantly worse than anything the company's correspondents had fully conveyed. Gates stepped onto the landing stage and faced the survivors who had gathered to meet him, and the silence that preceded any formal greeting lasted long enough to register as its own kind of communication. Percy came forward to give the official welcome, his council book under his arm and his clothing in the condition that 6 months of the starving time had produced, patched and loose, and carrying in its very fabric the evidence of everything the winter had required. He gave Gates the essential summary in the measured terms that the situation and his own temperament both suggested. The numbers of the dead, the state of the stores, the condition of the walls, the continuing presence of Powhatan watchers at the tree line, the absence of any significant food reserves that could sustain the combined company through another season without substantial outside help. Gates listened without interrupting, his face maintaining the controlled composure of a man trained to receive bad news without allowing his reaction to it to worsen the situation for those delivering it. He then asked to see the storehouse and the full extent of the company before making any decisions, and the group walked through the river gate and into the enclosure, where the lanes and the empty huts and the swept-clean shelves of the raised storehouse completed the account that Percy's words had begun. The Bermuda party that came ashore with Gates numbered roughly 150 people, and their physical contrast with the Jamestown survivors was visible enough to require no comment from anyone who observed it. The island months had been difficult by ordinary standards, marked by the psychological strain of isolation and the constant labour of building the 2 small ships, but Bermuda had fed its involuntary residents with a generosity that the Virginia Peninsula had conspicuously withheld from the people who had spent the same months inside the triangular palisade. The sea turtles that nested on the beaches, the wild pigs that the Spanish had introduced in earlier visits, the abundant seabirds that could be taken by hand in their nesting colonies, and the freshwater springs that ran clear through the island's interior had together provided a diet that, while not comfortable by English domestic standards, had been adequate to maintain health and working capacity through the 9 months of enforced residence. The Bermuda survivors showed it in their faces and their movements. The difference between people who had been adequately fed and people who had not being one of those distinctions that requires no medical training to observe. Gates took in this contrast as he walked the Jamestown lanes with Percy, and the implications of what it meant for the combined company's ability to sustain itself through another Virginia season assembled themselves into a conclusion that the storehouse visit confirmed beyond any remaining doubt. The council meeting that Gates called on the evening of his arrival brought together the surviving Jamestown leadership and the senior members of the Bermuda party in the church building that Percy had maintained as the colony's administrative centre through the winter. Gates reviewed the full situation with the systematic thoroughness of a military commander assessing a position, working through the storehouse inventory, the condition of the defences, the health status of the combined company, the available vessels, and the state of relations with the Powhatan in sequence, giving each factor the same careful attention before moving to the next. The conclusion that emerged from this assessment was not one that Gates had anticipated bringing before a council on his first evening in Virginia, but the figures made it unavoidable for any honest reading of the situation. The combined stores from the Bermuda ships, the salted turtle meat and pork and dried fish that the island months had provided, added to whatever the Jamestown survivors had managed to accumulate through the spring foraging, would sustain the combined company of roughly 200 people for a matter of weeks rather than months. The Powhatan remained unwilling to trade in quantities sufficient to make a meaningful difference. The fields lay untended and unplanted. No supply fleet had appeared on the river, and no reliable information existed about when one might. The arithmetic, reviewed from every available angle, produced the same answer each time it was calculated. Gates presented the council's unanimous conclusion to the assembled company in the open square the following morning. Reading the decision in plain language, without elaborate preamble, the settlement would be abandoned. The structures that could not be taken aboard the ships would be burned to prevent their use by any force that might follow. The entire company would embark on the available vessels and proceed down the James River to the Chesapeake Bay, where they would wait for a reasonable period for any relief fleet that might be approaching, and sail for the English fishing settlements at Newfoundland, if none appeared. The survivors listened to this announcement with a quietness that contained no protest and no visible surprise. The reaction of people who had already done the emotional work of accepting the possibility during the long weeks when the storehouse was nearly empty and the horizon remained stubbornly clear of incoming sails. The decision had the quality of a conclusion that the situation had been building toward for months, and hearing it stated formally by the man who now held legitimate authority to state it was less a shock than a release. The relief of a weight that had been carried in private, now acknowledged publicly and converted into action. The river outside the walls moved with the same unhurried pace it had maintained through everything, and the people who had survived the starving time began the practical work of preparing to leave the place where so many of them had died. The evacuation of Jamestown proceeded with the organized efficiency of a community that had spent months developing practical competence in doing difficult things with minimal resources and reduced personnel. Gates directed the loading with the systematic attention he had applied to every other assessment since his arrival, assigning the Bermuda party and the stronger of the Jamestown survivors to the physical work of carrying barrels and tools and canvas to the landing stage, while the weaker members of the company prepared their personal belongings for the transfer to the ships. The council records, maintained by Percy through the entire winter with a consistency that represented one of the Starving Time's quieter achievements, were wrapped in oilskin and carried aboard the Deliverance as among the first items secured. The maps that Smith had drawn during his exploring expeditions, the rough charts of the Chesapeake and its tributaries that had guided traders and supply ships through the previous seasons, were similarly protected and loaded early, because Gates understood that knowledge of the territory had a value that would outlast whatever happened to the settlement itself. The tools that remained in working condition were inventoried and distributed between the ships according to their weight and the available space, iron being precious enough that none of it would be left behind if the loading could accommodate it, livestock that had survived the winter, a handful of pigs that had proved too useful for breeding to slaughter through the worst months, were driven aboard with the cheerful indifference to human drama that animals always demonstrate at moments of historical significance. The burning of the fort was the final act before departure, ordered by Gates and carried out by small teams who moved through the enclosure with torches in the late afternoon of the 7th of June, 1610, touching flame to the stacked firewood that had been placed against the interior walls specifically for this purpose. The church went first, its simple timber frame catching quickly in the dry summer air. The rough benches and the altar that Percy had maintained through the winter consumed in the same fire that took the roof. The storehouse followed, its raised floor and empty shelves burning with a speed that confirmed how thoroughly the winter had stripped it of everything combustible that might otherwise have slowed the flames. The huts along the lanes went in sequence, each one adding its own column of smoke to the growing cloud that rose above the peninsula and drifted downstream on the afternoon wind. The palisade stakes, their timber aged and dried by 3 Virginia summers, caught along the inner face and burned steadily as the company watched from the ships and the shallop. The triangular walls that had defined the colony's existence since May of 1607, collapsing inward onto the ash of everything they had enclosed. The Powhatan watchers at the tree line observed the smoke and the fire with an attention that no English account recorded from the native perspective. Their thoughts about what they were seeing lost to the same silence that swallowed most of what the Powhatan witnessed during these years. What the fire meant to them, whether it represented the victory their strategy had been designed to achieve, or something more complicated that their own knowledge of English persistence might have suggested, remained unrecorded and can only be imagined across the distance of 4 centuries. The ships moved downstream with the outgoing tide as the evening light faded, the Deliverance leading with Gates aboard and the Patience and the shallop following in the sequence that the river's navigation required. On deck, the company arranged themselves in the spaces that the loaded cargo permitted. The survivors of the Starving Time and the Bermuda party mixed together now in the physical proximity that the small vessels imposed. Their earlier distinction as separate groups blurred by the shared experience of the departure. The burned fort receded behind them as the river bent and the trees on the banks closed the view. And the company that had held the James River Peninsula through the worst winter in English colonial history left it without ceremony. Carried downstream by the same tidal current that had brought the original ships upstream 3 years earlier, conversation on deck stayed practical and quiet, the topics being the river's depth at the next bend, the management of the cargo, and the state of the provisions rather than any retrospective accounting of what the winter had cost. That accounting would come later, in the journals and reports that Percy and Gates and others would write when they had the distance and the stability that reflection requires. For the moment the company moved with the river and watched the familiar banks slide past in the gathering dark and did not look back more than the occasion required. The morning of the 10th of June found the small fleet anchored in a sheltered position near the mouth of the James River, where the water widened toward the Chesapeake and the horizon opened in a way that the narrow river corridor had never permitted. Gates and the council had agreed to wait at this anchorage for a period before committing to the longer voyage north toward Newfoundland, and the company had settled into the shipboard routines of rationing and watchkeeping with the adaptability of people for whom routine had become a survival mechanism independent of its specific content. The fishing lines that went over the sides each morning added modest catches to the island provisions, and the women prepared meals in the ship's galleys with the same careful economy they had applied to the common kettles inside the fort. It was on the morning of the 2nd day at this anchorage that the lookout at the masthead of the Deliverance called out in a voice whose excitement was audible across the water to the other vessels. Sails on the northern horizon, moving south with a purpose and a size that distinguished them immediately from anything the small evacuation fleet could have produced itself. The reoccupation of the James River Peninsula began within hours of the combined fleet's return upstream, and the energy that Delaware brought to the task was immediately and visibly different from anything the site had seen since John Smith's departure the previous autumn. The governor came ashore with the bearing of a man who had sailed across the Atlantic with a clear mandate and intended to execute it regardless of what the ground looked like when he arrived. And the ground, covered in the ash and charred timber of the burned fort, required a considerable exercise of that intention. He organized the combined company into work teams before the day was out, drawing on the Bermuda party's still adequate physical capacity and the Jamestown survivors' intimate knowledge of the site's layout and the surrounding terrain, combining the two groups into an integrated workforce that could begin the practical business of reconstruction without waiting for the formal establishment of administrative structures. Carpenters from the English supply ships began framing new storehouses using fresh timber cut from the nearest woods, while labourers cleared the debris of the burned structures from the lanes. The women sorted the provisions brought from Delaware's ships with the experienced efficiency of people who had spent months rationing what remained of far smaller stores. identifying which barrels needed immediate attention and which could be safely stowed for later distribution. The new storehouse rose first, its raised floor and reinforced walls reflecting the lessons that 2 winters of inadequate storage had provided at considerable cost. And when its doors were secured against the first night's dampness, the symbolic importance of that single completed structure was not lost on anyone who had watched the previous one burn. Delaware enforced a discipline from his first full day in command that reflected both his military background and the company's hard-won understanding of what had allowed previous seasons to deteriorate so badly. The work rules he posted were explicit and comprehensive, covering daily assignments, ration allocations, guard rotations, and the penalties for idleness or theft of common stores, and they were applied with the consistency that Percy's more collegial approach had been unable to maintain through the difficult autumn. Gentlemen who presented their social rank as a reason for exemption from physical labour found that Delaware's interpretation of his authority under the new charter left considerably less room for such arguments than the council system had previously provided. The daily tallies of work completed returned to the precise accounting that Smith had pioneered, and the storehouse records were updated at each council meeting with a regularity that kept the colony's resource situation visible and unambiguous to everyone responsible for managing it. The effect on the fort's functioning was rapid and measurable. Buildings went up faster than anyone who had watched the winter's depleted company struggle through minimal maintenance would have thought possible. Gardens were laid out beyond the repaired palisade in organised rows, their planting following the pattern of cornhills interspersed with English peas and beans that the settlers had learned from watching Powhatan fields through 3 years of careful observation. The relations with the Powhatan that had been frozen by the blockade strategy began to thaw slowly and unevenly, as Delaware's substantially larger and better provisioned company made the calculation of continued isolation less clearly advantageous for either side. The governor sent diplomatic delegations to the nearest villages with gifts that reflected an understanding of what Powhatan valued. Copper above all, in quantities sufficient to signal serious intent rather than perfunctory gesture. The responses were cautious, and the quantities of corn that came back in the initial exchanges were modest. But the trading canoes that had been absent from the river since Smith's departure began to reappear at intervals. Their presence alone, representing a shift in the Powhatan position that the council recognised as significant, even before the actual food they carried could make a material difference to the stores. Chief Powhatan observed the changed situation with the same careful assessment he had applied to every development since the English ships first appeared in the Chesapeake. Calculating the new balance of forces and adjusting his strategy to match a reality that now included a fort with 200 people, substantial military supplies, and a governor whose commission from the English king carried a weight of institutional backing that the earlier council system had conspicuously lacked. The absolute blockade of the previous winter was not reinstated, though trading never returned to the easy frequency that Smith's personal relationships with village leaders had produced at its best. Into this context of cautious rebuilding and diplomatic recalibration arrived a man whose contribution to the colony's long-term survival would prove more consequential than any military victory or diplomatic agreement that the period produced. John Rolfe had been aboard the Sea Venture when it wrecked on Bermuda, had survived the 9 island months with Gates and Summers, and had arrived at Jamestown with the Deliverance carrying among his personal possessions a quantity of tobacco seeds obtained in Trinidad during the outward voyage. The native tobacco that the Powhatan grew for their own ceremonial use was a harsh variety that English smokers had sampled and largely rejected in favour of the sweeter Spanish leaf imported from the Caribbean at considerable expense. Rolfe's seeds were of a different strain, a milder and more aromatic variety that he believed might suit the Virginia soil while producing a leaf that English and European markets would actually want to buy. He planted his first experimental plots in the cleared ground beyond the fort's repaired palisade in the growing season of 1611, tending the broad-leafed plants through the Virginia summer with the attentive patience of a man who understood that he was testing a hypothesis rather than establishing a certainty. Watching for the signs that the soil and climate were producing, the the quality of leaf that his calculations suggested was possible. The results of those first experimental plots exceeded what Rolfe had allowed himself to expect. The Virginia soil, dismissed by the original settlers as unsuitable for the English crops that had struggled in its sandy loam, proved extraordinarily well suited to tobacco cultivation, producing leaves of the size, texture, and aromatic quality that Rolfe's Caribbean seeds had promised. The curing process he applied after harvest, hanging the cut leaves in sheds where air could circulate around them through the weeks required for the moisture to draw out and the sugars to concentrate, produced a finished product that bore comparison with the Spanish varieties that dominated the English market. Rolfe packed the first sample shipment into barrels in 1612 and sent it back to England on one of the returning supply vessels, with the careful documentation of a man presenting evidence rather than making claims. The merchants who received and sampled it in London found it genuinely competitive with what they had been importing from Spanish sources, and the Virginia Company received the news of its quality with the particular intensity of an organisation that had been looking for exactly this kind of development for the better part of a decade. Here was the commodity that the original investors had imagined finding in the form of gold or silver or a northwest passage to Asia, none of which had appeared, arriving instead in the form of dried leaves from a plant that would grow abundantly in the same soil that had nearly starved the people trying to establish themselves upon it. The spread of tobacco cultivation through the colony in the years following Rolfe's initial success reshaped every aspect of Jamestown's existence in ways that were profound and not uniformly positive. Delaware encouraged the shift toward the new crop once the basic food supply had been stabilized. Allocating garden plots to individual settlers who agreed to plant a portion of their ground in tobacco while maintaining their contribution to the common corn and pea stores, the incentive of personal profit, modest at first and growing as the London market's appetite proved consistent, produced a level of individual agricultural initiative that the common store system had never quite managed to generate. Men who had needed strict enforcement to complete their daily work assignments under Smith and Delaware now worked longer hours without supervision because the tobacco growing in their personal plots represented a direct return on their own labour in a form that the collective system had not provided. The marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas in 1614 added a diplomatic dimension to these economic developments, the union producing a period of relative peace with the Powhatan that allowed the expanding tobacco fields to be worked with less constant vigilance about movement beyond the palisade. The river that had nearly carried the colony to its abandonment now carried the loaded tobacco barrels downstream to the waiting ships each autumn, and the ships returned with the supplies and settlers that the revenue those barrels generated could now reliably fund. Lord Thomas West, Baron de la Warre, stood on the deck of his flagship as it moved south through the Chesapeake toward the James River entrance, carrying with him the full authority of his appointment as governor for life under the reorganized Virginia Company charter and the substantial resources of a properly equipped relief fleet. 3 ships, the Delaware, the Blessing, and the Hercules, carried between them more than 150 new settlers, substantial stores of meal and salted meat and seed, livestock in numbers sufficient to re-establish a breeding population, tools of every kind that the company's experience with previous supply problems had suggested were most critically needed, and the medical supplies that the colony's repeated cycles of fever and dysentery had made as essential as food. Delaware had left England in April with clear instructions and a clear mission, expecting to find a settlement that had been strengthened by the 3rd Supply Fleet and was ready to be expanded under firm central governance. The fact that his fleet was instead intercepted by 2 small cedar vessels carrying the entire surviving population of that settlement in the process of abandoning it was an outcome that his instructions had not anticipated, and his response to it revealed the quality of leadership that his appointment had been intended to bring to the venture. The meeting of the 2 fleets in the open water of the Chesapeake was managed with a speed and decisiveness that the situation demanded. Gates transferred to the flagship by small boat and delivered his report to Delaware in person, covering the essential facts of the starving time, the condition of the survivors, the state of the fort when he had arrived, and the council's unanimous decision to evacuate. in the direct manner that military men of the period used with one another when circumstances required clarity over comfort. Delaware listened, asked questions about the specific condition of the defences and the nature of the Powhatan blockade, reviewed the numbers Percy had recorded in the council books that Gates had brought from the deliverance, and reached his decision with a promptness that left no space for the hesitation that a less confident leader might have allowed the weight of the situation to produce. The order went out to the combined fleet within the hour. Every vessel would turn about and proceed upstream. Jamestown would be reoccupied. The evacuation was over. The river that had carried the survivors downstream 2 days earlier now received them back on the returning tide. The combined fleet of 5 ships moving upstream past the familiar banks, with the added weight of Delaware's authority and Delaware's supplies behind them, the burned ruins of the fort waiting on the low peninsula to receive whatever the new governor chose to build upon their ashes. The James River has been carrying things downstream for longer than any human record exists to describe. It carried the first English ships upstream in 1607 with their cargo of ambition and inadequate preparation. It carried John Smith's trading canoes loaded with corn in the seasons when discipline and practical intelligence kept the colony alive. It carried the evacuation fleet downstream in June of 1610, with 60 survivors and the ashes of a burned fort receding behind them, and then carried them back upstream 2 days later, when Delaware's sails appeared on the horizon and reversed the most consequential decision the colony had yet made. By the 1620s it was carrying tobacco barrels to the waiting ships each autumn, their contents funding the steady expansion of a settlement that had once been reduced to a handful of hollow-faced people holding a damaged palisade against a Virginia winter. The river did not change through any of this. It maintained its unhurried course between the same low banks, past the same marshes and the same stands of timber, with the indifference of something operating on a time scale that makes the difference between catastrophe and recovery a barely perceptible fluctuation in the longer pattern. What changed was everything that happened on and beside it, and the starving time of 1609 to 1610 was the hinge point around which the most significant of those changes turned. The moment when the venture came closest to ending, and instead found, in that narrowness, the lessons that allowed it to continue. The Virginia Company's response to the full account of the starving time, when Percy's records and Gates's reports reached London in the summer of 1610, was a reorganization so thorough that it amounted to a fundamental rethinking of what colonial settlement required. The earlier charters had been built on assumptions that the experience at Jamestown had systematically demolished. The assumption that gentlemen with limited practical skills could establish a self-sufficient settlement in an unfamiliar landscape if given adequate initial supplies had been tested and found catastrophically wrong. The assumption that native populations would remain reliably cooperative trading partners regardless of how their land and resources were treated had been tested and found wrong in a way that nearly eliminated the entire colony. The assumption that a council of equals could provide effective governance in conditions that required rapid, consistent, and sometimes unpopular decisions had been tested and found wrong with a regularity that the succession of ineffective leadership through the fort's first 3 years made impossible to dispute. The new arrangements that emerged from these lessons: single executive authority, stricter labour requirements written into law, more realistic planning for the quantity of supplies needed per settler per season, and greater attention to the skills that incoming colonists actually needed to possess, reflected the specific failures that the starving time had exposed with a directness that no theoretical analysis from London could have produced. The influence of Jamestown's experience extended northward along the Atlantic coast in ways that shaped every subsequent English colonial venture of the 17th century. When the Pilgrims made their landing at Plymouth in November of 1620, they carried with them detailed accounts of the Virginia experience, and the decisions they made in their first seasons reflected a specific awareness of the mistakes that had nearly destroyed the earlier settlement. They planted immediately, before establishing the comfortable housing that their exhausted company would have preferred to prioritize. They worked to establish trading relationships with the Wampanoag people of the region with a diplomatic care that drew on the lessons about native cooperation that the Jamestown experience had so expensively taught. They organised their labour with an attention to collective contribution that echoed the reforms Smith had introduced and Delaware had formalised into law. None of this meant that Plymouth avoided hardship in its first years, because the conditions that colonial settlement imposed on unprepared people in unfamiliar environments were not entirely preventable by any level of advanced knowledge. But the particular combination of factors that had produced the starving time, the sudden overpopulation, the dependence on a single external food source, the loss of experienced leadership, and the absence of adequate reserves, was not reproduced with the same catastrophic completeness in the settlements that came after Jamestown, in part because those settlements knew what to guard against. The human cost that the starving time had imposed on the specific individuals who lived and died through it resisted the kind of abstraction that historical analysis tends to apply to numbers. Of the more than 500 people present inside the fort in the autumn of 1609, approximately 440 had died by the spring of 1610, a mortality rate of roughly 88% over a period of 6 months. Behind each of those 440 deaths was a person who had crossed an ocean with some version of hope, who had endured the voyage and the adjustment to an unfamiliar climate, and the slow dawning understanding that the promotional literature had not prepared them for the reality they had arrived into, who had contributed what they could to the collective effort of survival before the winter's combination of hunger and cold and disease and isolation extracted the final cost. The graves outside the palisade, dug shallow in the frozen ground and marked with wooden crosses that the weather quickly reduced to unidentifiable fragments, held people whose names Percy had recorded in the council books with the same careful handwriting he applied to everything else. A form of acknowledgement that was modest in its means and significant in its persistence. The archaeological work at the Jamestown site has continued to recover evidence of those lives and deaths from the layers of earth that accumulated over them. Each excavated fragment adding specificity to a record that the surviving written accounts can only partially supply. John Rolfe's tobacco and Pocahontas's marriage into English colonial society represented the twin pillars of the recovery that followed the starving time, one economic and one diplomatic, each providing a form of stability that the settlement had previously lacked. The tobacco economy that expanded through the 1610s and 20s transformed the colony's relationship with the land from an exercise in subsistence survival into a commercial enterprise whose products were wanted in markets far beyond Virginia. The revenue it generated funded the supply ships that arrived with increasing regularity, carrying tools and seed and livestock and settlers whose numbers grew the population past the level where a single difficult winter could reduce it again to the desperate margin of 1610. The peace that Pocahontas's marriage facilitated with the Powhatan Confederacy lasted until her death in England in 1617, and the subsequent deterioration of relations that culminated in the Powhatan Uprising of 1622. A reminder that the diplomatic gains of the recovery period rested on personal relationships rather than structural agreements, and were consequently as fragile as the individuals who embodied them. The colony survived the 1622 attack because it had grown large enough and established enough that a single violent event, however severe in its immediate toll, could not reduce it to the condition the starving time had created through the slower and more patient mechanism of hunger and isolation. The first elected legislative assembly in English America met at Jamestown in July of 1619. Its representatives drawn from the various settlements that had spread along the James River in the decades since Delaware's rescue had given the colony its second chance. The Assembly's establishment represented a development that nobody standing inside the burned ruins in June of 1610 could have imagined as possible within a decade. The transformation of a barely surviving outpost into a political community capable of governing itself through representative institutions. The starving time stood behind this development not as a cause but as a precondition, the crucible through which the settlement had been reduced and then rebuilt in a form that had discarded the assumptions that made the original venture so vulnerable and had replaced them with the practical knowledge that survival in Virginia actually required. The river carried the tobacco ships downstream each autumn past the site of those early graves, and the assembly met in the rebuilt church where Percy had kept his records through the worst winter. and the settlement that had once held 60 hollow-faced survivors grew into the foundation of a colonial enterprise whose consequences, for every people whose lives it touched, would extend across the following centuries in ways that the men who had crossed the Atlantic in 1607 could not have foreseen, and the history that followed would never finish accounting for. The river still carries things. It always has. And somewhere beneath its surface, in the accumulated sediment of 400 years, the James River holds the quiet record of everything it witnessed during the winter when England's foothold in America came within a season's length of disappearing entirely, and did not,